Kia ora, and welcome to the Dawn Chorus for Thursday, the 24th of October. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. This is my daily email newsletter and podcast, now with a video, that looks at Aotearoa's political economy around housing, climate and poverty reduction. I wanted to focus on a couple of news items today and also take you through some of the charts, quotes, numbers of the day that are in today's email newsletter in a presentation that I've got that I prepared earlier. So let's try this. Firstly, out of Wellington, we have Rachel Thomas reporting in the Post from a document obtained from Health NZ under the OAA that in February this year, Health NZ considered 59 particular cost-saving measures when it thought there was a risk of much bigger budget cuts than it eventually had to find in the budget that was delivered in May. This list of 59 cuts included the potential for co-payments on emergency department visits, i.e. paying to go to the hospital if you were sick. Now that breaches a fundamental expectation about our publicly funded healthcare system, as was pointed out in the article by the Senior Doctors Association. The other measures included cheaper hospital food, which was less nutritious, higher parking charges, and also various restrictions on the availability and numbers of doctors and medical staff. You can see more detail in the email newsletter attached. The reason it's worth talking about, even though they haven't been introduced, because the cuts expected in the budget were not as large as Health NZ was talking about, is that those cuts will have to come in the next 2 to 3 years if the government's going to meet its forecasts for a fiscal contraction needed to get to budget surplus by 2027-28 and to start reducing debt. This is something that the Treasury has warned, that the fiscal contraction per capita and in real terms will be the largest ever seen in Aotearoa because of the scale of the growth in spending naturally coming from the health and education system as our population grows, and because effectively this is about the government trying to reduce the size of government below 30% of GDP when the promises we've made around freely available hospital care, New Zealand super from the age of 65 at 66% of the average wage, those sorts of things are simply, I think, not possible with a state remaining under the size of 30%, at least as long as you don't tax wealth or capital gains. So keep an eye out for that list of 59. It was in a spreadsheet reported by Rachel Thomas in a bit of a scoop today in the Post, and that's a paywalled article. Secondly, I want to talk about the announcement this week from Simeon Brown, the local government and transport and energy minister, that a Crown observer would be put into the Wellington Council. Now, in the announcement about this, he argued this was necessary because the council was making decisions to front load the cost of fixing water networks onto rates rather than borrowing to pay for infrastructure. That's an interesting approach because the government until now has been very reluctant to use its own balance sheet, i.e. the Crown's balance sheet, to borrow to pay for infrastructure. It's much more interested in using private funding or to get congestion charges and water charges to pay the bill, if you like, for not just building infrastructure, but maintaining it as we go along. Because about a third, every time you spend, let's say, $10 billion on infrastructure, you're having to spend 30% of that every year in ongoing maintenance of that new asset. So an asset isn't just an upfront cost, it's a series of costs as you go. And that is an interesting approach from the government. They're essentially saying, we don't want to borrow, but we want councils to do it, i.e. the ratepayers should bear the cost. Quite sensibly and admirably, the government's advisors have told them that it's actually much cheaper in the long run for ratepayers if they use debt to pay for infrastructure than rather than pay as you go by simply increasing rates. And Simeon Brown, in his argument for the Crown Observer, pointed out that 94% of the water infrastructure repairs and maintenance and investment was being paid for upfront by rates in Wellington and just 6% from debt. And he said that if they'd done it the other way around, then ratepayers would have saved $700 million over the next 10 years. It would be interesting to see that similar sort of analysis applied to the government overall, particularly around the billions and billions of dollars worth of spending planned on roads, which are currently going to be paid for mostly by tolls, congestion charges, and PPPs. And when you look at the comparative costs of using just boring old Crown debt, which is the cheapest around, versus PPPs and congestion charges and our water charges, it's way, way cheaper to do it through Crown debt. But the government has decided, for its own purposes, that its North Star is to get government spending as a share of GDP under 30% and to get government net debt back down to 30% from over 40% right now. That's despite our trading partners and others with similar credit ratings having debt closer to 60 to 100%. And this is part of our long-term problem with a focus on getting debt low at the expense of investing in infrastructure, particularly when we have fast-growing population. And you can see more on that in the email newsletter. In particular, the concerns expressed by Campbell Barry, the Lower Hutt Mayor, that this argument could be applied much more widely than just Wellington. If you're going to say that councils need to use debt to pay for water infrastructure, then there's a lot more councils that could do it. Now, there is a deal already been struck with Auckland, but even then, there's still a lot of water to go under the bridge, pardon the pun, around getting the local government funding agency to essentially do the borrowing on behalf of the new water authorities being created by various water authorities in the Local Water Done Well project, which in a way is National's replacement for Three Waters. Next up, I wanted to have a look at a good investigation being done by Consumer NZ into the, quote, dynamic pricing that Air New Zealand does around school holidays. This is where you discover around the weeks of the school holidays, the prices for trips, particularly overseas, but also domestically, go up. And Consumer NZ found that in the worst case scenario of a family of four travelling from Christchurch to Australia over the school holidays, the increase in the cost of those flights is around 167%. And it just reinforces the problems we have in our economy with monopolies or near monopoly situations, increasing inflation and shifting the profit share to the owners of those businesses. Now, in many cases, the owners of the businesses are partially government owned. And we have a basic problem here where the regulators of these companies are, in some cases, the shareholders of these companies. And it's one of the reasons I think either the government needs to take over these businesses 100% or to sell off the remaining 51% and then be proper regulators of those sectors once they've sold them off. I'm not going to hold my breath waiting for those. But a good investigation, and there's a link in the email newsletter to that. Now, in the chart of the day, I wanted to point to an analysis done by a think tank in the United States of the differing tax packages put forward by Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in this election, which is less than 2 weeks away. Some people argue that there isn't much difference in the policies between the two, but there clearly is in the tax policies. And it's a real case of Robin Hood versus the Sheriff of Nottingham here. Robin Hood being Kamala Harris, her tax policies would see taxes cut for the bottom 20% of the population by 7% and taxes increase for the richest 1%. by 4.1%. And it's the exact opposite for Donald Trump. He would increase taxes on the poorest and cut taxes on the richest. So worth keeping an eye on the result of the election there. And just to give you a sense of the alternatives, this is my solutions piece of the day. You might have heard that Norway in the last couple of years has increased its wealth tax substantially from 0.85% of wealth to 1.1%. Now, one of the arguments against it by those very wealthy people in Norway and by others looking at the Norwegian example is that when you put up taxes for the richest, they're so mobile, they can just jump on a plane and take their place of residence and therefore their tax and wealth with them, and you effectively get less money. This is something called the Laffer curve, the idea that as you squeeze your tax rate higher and higher and higher, eventually people stop working, that's the theory, or they move, and therefore you get less money overall. However, and there was quite a bit of coverage in the last 6 months or so about a number of high-profile, very rich people from Norway leaving the country and going to Switzerland and taking their money with them. And the assumption was that actually, it was counterproductive to increase your wealth taxes on the wealthiest because they just move. However, there's been various studies on this showing that when you do increase wealth taxes on the wealthiest, most of them don't move, and you actually increase your taxes. And that's what we've seen in this chart that I've linked to in the email newsletter, showing a significant increase in the taxes achieved by Norway because of its wealth tax increase. And that's my solutions news of the day. And I just wanted to point to an excellent cartoon today from Sharon Murdoch. It was actually in the paper yesterday, with a good look at some of the issues and language being used by members of the coalition, and another day of parliamentary dramas and shenanigans yesterday over Andrew Bailey's reported comments to a staff member on a visit to a business a few days ago. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was today's Dawn Chorus for Thursday, the 24th of October. Just a reminder that there will be a hoon today. We're back on track at 4 o'clock. Ka kite anō.